So we're going to take a few moments just to take a look at how I UV unwrap this spud gun. My last UVing videos using, in my opinion, a far simpler asset to help display UVing techniques, which was the pipe wrench. If you haven't had a look at that, make sure you do, as there may be some things you might find helpful there, especially if you struggle to UV hard surface objects. This is a little bit more complex as it has slightly more organic shapes to it, and there's a lot more parts to this. We'll be UVing in Blender, but the concepts remain software agnostic. Typically, I start with the grip. I'm not really sure why. Perhaps it's the largest form of the handgun and I just want to get out of the way. In any case, one of the first things I do before unwrapping a section is to just do a quick check over the parts of the mesh and whether any flat surfaces are actually flat along the respective axis. Sometimes in the low poly mesh creation process, a vert or edge may go astray, so it's good just to check over before going any further. And so I do this by selecting a single face and using the tool select linked faces. This helps me see any parts that aren't actually aligned properly. I do notice a couple, so using the active element, I'll align the faces to the last selected face that I know is flat. Before placing my seams, I'll just clear any sharp edges and start placing seams on the most obvious edges, namely these flat pieces. What I'm doing here are two operations to make selections super fast. Select linked flat faces just like before, and then converting that to the boundary edge by using select boundary loop. I've bound these tools to my own hotkeys so it just feels natural and super fast. Once I've got them, I'll just mark the seam there. Easy really. Some parts are kind of tricky, and in some instances there isn't always a perfect solution, and it's where testing different UV layouts and bakes come in. It's always worth trying to find the most optimal solution, so just take a step back and take some time to plan your next steps of your UV. I often imagine how the UV will unfold and whether it'll be best for my current situation and usage of the asset, or I'll just go on to another area and think about it later. And again, just making sure that those flat surfaces are actually flat. This will help with the bake and with the UV islands that are separate. If you're like me, sometimes the mesh needs a little bit of optimizing even after you've started UVing. It's best to get this fixed now, so if you do see any odd geometry, fix it as you come across it. Otherwise it'll be a bit of a nightmare to fix later on, and we don't want to be going backwards and redoing any texturing work. In some instances like this, the low poly you've made might not have the ideal geometry for the best seam placement. This is a bit of a tricky situation. This grip isn't ideal. I really don't want to place an edge right in the middle though and essentially split the mesh in half. I could, but I'd be adding a lot more geometry as a result, and if I can avoid that, I probably should. But perhaps the more geometry issue isn't so big of an issue today with how well engines can handle them. But nevertheless, what I could do is to adjust some of the edges to create a smoother transition from the lip to the side of the grip. Or I could work with what I've got and loop the seam more on the inside of the edges, like here. And I can adjust some of the geometry just to make it a bit smoother, like here. So I'm just going to give it a bit of a test unwrap, see how well it does. I don't use anything fancy here, it's quite literally me just hitting U to unwrap. Blender's unfolding algorithm is actually pretty great. One thing I do need to check is if there's no odd scaling values. If your scale values are anything but 1, you'll more than likely see issues in your unwrap. And doing test unwraps help you find any issues early on, from missing seams to unwanted stretching. You can use the UV sync selection to see the selected UV island on the model in the 3D view. So I can see here I'll need to add in another seam here to unfold this geometry properly. And that's more like it. So what I'll do is move some of the islands just to make sure that they're properly separated from one another. There isn't any seams that need placing. I can see here that it looks a little bit odd. There we go. I need to separate that. Let's unwrap this again. Or I can just move it in the UV and it's automatically separated. But I'm just going to unwrap this just in case. And I'll average the islands back out just to make sure. And I'm just going to do a quick pack, making sure I just need to load up my preset. And turn off advanced heuristic, as that's more for complex items with many islands. And let's just hit pack. Do a real quick one just to see how it works out. And let's put a UV checkerboard on. Then when I'm happy, I'll set the seam edges to hard or sharp edge, which is necessary for hard surface objects, but not always. It's just depending on where the seam is placed. And actually, I'm kind of happy with that. So I'll go on to the next section, which is the barrel and trigger housing. So I'll just clear my sharps, and using that same process of linked flat faces and then select border loops, I will make quick selections. And I'll also make sure that the flat faces are indeed flat. Sometimes when you don't check it and you place seams, you'll find out that this section actually isn't flat at all. So let's make this flat. Let's get rid of those seams and place them again. I really do like Blender's UVing tools. Despite what many people may say, they're actually really quite nice. And I'm just going to improve the geometry here actually. It's not as smooth as I'd like. I'm imagining this from a first person view and seeing that silhouette of this edge here, it would look kind of faceted. So I'm just going to bevel it and space those edges out. Makes it all nice and even. The boundary loop tool was really a game changer for me. It really sped up the whole process, and it just made the entire UVing process actually quite enjoyable. And I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with. It's something that I wanted to make a video about, which was the pipe wrench tool, and I wanted to make that whole process a lot more enjoyable for people. And I had some good responses actually, which was quite nice. A little trick here that you can do to quickly triangulate or connect those edges or terminate those edges is just to triangulate that face, that engon, and it should 9 times out of 10 create the proper geometry for you. So the times where I wouldn't put a hard edge is directly right here on that seam that I just placed. Cylinders along the vertical edge or the long edge rather than the ring edge. Is that right? Loop or ring? I don't know. Please tell me. Either way, I wouldn't put a hard edge on that seam because it would sometimes make the seam more visible even when baked. This was a fairly interesting object to create, and especially to UV, because it's not like a normal gun, because most of the parts are actually all joined together. So it was a big Boolean operation. It's quite fun actually. It was a hack week for work, and I thought, why not a spud gun in Rust? Again, I wouldn't put a hard edge there because it would just make this sphere look a bit strange, especially when working with LUTs, which I do and I have to make by hand, which is a pain. So I'm just figuring out what else needs to be done on this section, just making sure I haven't got any double or unnecessary seams, which I do. So I've taken those off and I'm just wondering what the result would be, and it would basically unwrap almost like a mirror image of those two sides, which can be ideal in some instances, but I felt why not just keep it in and just keep it simple. Might not be the most optimal way to UV this object, but it's the way I chose to do it, and in the end I had really good results. So no regrets. Okay, let's UV. Unwrap. Just make sure there's no scaling values on it. and there isn't. Let's do a test. So I'm going to straighten these out. Let's pick the right one. So I use a UV toolkit, Zen UV and UV Packmaster 3 or 2, whichever one it is. And those come with a whole host of awesome tools. If you're looking for UV toolkit and can't find it on the internet, which you probably wouldn't be able to because the developer stopped developing it, just went missing basically, don't know what happened to the guy, but actually it's available on the extensions on later versions of Blender. Currently in this video I'm on 3.3.2. I've since moved to 4.2, and in the extensions tab you can actually find UV toolkit right there and just enable it, and it just works and it's awesome. It has a lot of tools in it, like straighten. It won't work if there's any triangles in your mesh. It will just make it go all strange. So I'm just going to straighten some parts out. Ideally, I don't want any of the parts going diagonal, because you actually get less resolution in diagonal UVs, because they try and share pixels. I'm just going to use the orient to edge tool, which I'm not sure where that's from, either UV toolkit or Zen UV. Just making sure that everything that's supposed to be straight is straight, and trying to properly orientate the UVs. And in UV Packmaster, it has an option to disable rotation, or pre-rotation disable, which basically just stops it from rotating automatically straight away before even sorting. This way you get to keep the default or your chosen rotations of the UV islands, and I'm pretty happy with that. And I make sure to sharpen the biseams. So I want to make this one big island basically. So these caps, like cylinder objects that are capped off like this, but have a bevel on them, can be a bit tricky to figure out what to do for them as best. But as I just did there, just going for the lower edge loop, I'm just going to place a seam there and let the top have its own UV island. That looks alright. Let me see what it's like, and let's strain up some parts. Oh, that looks a bit strange. Let's have a look at this. What could be causing that? This is why it's so important just to do a test UV, really. So UV selection, and I can see it's that whole thing there. Of course it is. Right, let's try that again. There we go. So I'm just going to use Reshape Island, which is in the Zen UV toolkit, which is really great for non-square UVs. I could have probably got away with using straighten here, but I'm just going to have to do some manual work here to get this sorted. Like, yeah, see, straight away. So dumb. Might as well have just tried it out straight away. So again, just making sure everything is straight that's supposed to be straight. Sometimes straightening sections that aren't straight in the 3D model can actually give more stretching and less desirable results. So it's best sometimes to leave it as is. So I played with the idea of having everything orientated to the world, which in theory is good, but it really depends on the object and the reason why you're doing it. And it's not always beneficial for something like this. Let's say if I was using skins, even then, if I was making a weapon that would be skinned in a game by the community, like Rustus or CSGO, having it world orientated can be quite beneficial. It's definitely beneficial when you're texturing it, so you can understand the direction of something and making sure that something isn't flipped. But it's not always necessary, and it's trying to find that balance really. And I'm just using some of the Zen UV textures that come packaged with it just to visualize the UV a little bit better. Using these kind of UVs textures also helps with distortion. I think I'm just going to stick with this and carry on UVing. This whole process took about an hour to UV. I really do believe with the toolset that Blender gives you, even through add-ons, and you might hear some groans from the people in the back. Oh, add-ons, yeah, you can't get Blender to work how you want without add-ons. Well, actually, I really don't care, because I'd rather have Blender and spend a couple of $100 to have those add-ons indefinitely than pay thousands of pounds annually for just the basic software. But in any case, I really do think the toolset that Blender has, even with add-ons, is actually really quite powerful and makes UVing so quick, so incredibly quick. So here I'm just figuring out the best way to UV this. And I'm just playing around with some scene placement ideas. Because it's looking kind of funky to me. It's that ridge that sticks out. I'm not sure if I should be like splitting it up so much. Really what I'm trying to do here is to avoid any gradients in my UV or in my normal map. So if I leave it like this and have minimal UVs, islands, I'm definitely going to have gradients, but it means less UV islands. So there's a trade-off, and it really is down to the use case of the asset. So I'm just going to do a test here, and I'm noticing that there's some strangeness going on here that I'm not too keen about. I think I can just delete those verts. I'm not really happy with this, but maybe I am. My idea there was to use Zen UV's relax option to help smooth out the UV, but there was something wrong with my installation of it that prevented me from doing that. See, the problem with scaling like this is you get really horrible results, and to be honest, quite inaccurate results. But it's worth experimenting with this to make sure you get the best result. I'm already getting fed up with UVing this section of the object. I'm just looking through Zen UV to see if there's anything to help me. Just give it a quick pack just to see what it's like. And you can see there a lot of stretching. It's horrible actually. So I think what I do is I actually split it up again even more. Again, if this may not be the best way, may not be the optimal way, I may have overlooked something. I've already got a couple of ideas looking back at this now, how I could have improved this. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments or even on my Discord, which you'll be able to find in the description of this video, if it's on YouTube. See already that's much better. So I'm just going to project from view just to get a perfect UV island that matches what I'm seeing in the 3D view, side view. There we go. Then average scale those. And let me just do a quick pack for some reason. And turn off the UV in the view, in the editor. And there's some triangulation here, so I can't just use the straighten tool. I have to use, where is it gone? Reshape island. And basically what it does is the selected edge gets straightened, and then everything else conforms to that edge. There we go, I'm much happier with that. Again, not perfect, but because this is a hackweek project, it's not so bad. I'm just actually gonna flip that over to the other side. This will help with me not having to UV it twice, because that was a pain. By the way, there is a time lapse of this, so if you are interested in the entire process, please do check that video out. Now it's best to quadrify and straighten things as much as possible, as long as it doesn't introduce any unnecessary stretching. This just helps with the overall pack and saves way more space in the UV. Because the UV space is square, then having everything square and straight is only going to increase the space that you're able to use in your UV. Especially when everything is aligned properly and rotated properly. It's just the most efficient way of UVing. I could probably get away with not having those seams there at all, actually, and just letting it just unfold and relax it. But again, I really didn't want any gradients in my my normal map, so I didn't do that. I don't think. Maybe I did, and I'm lying to you. I did take away those. Okay. And the reason why I did that there is because of the angle, the overall angle going from one side, like face to the next face, angled face. It wasn't severe enough, it wasn't near enough to 90 degrees to really warrant seam placement there. This is one of the more frustrating things working with text, is that it doesn't really generate the best geometry. So again, it's just worth going over, just making sure that the geometry integrity is perfect. I found this part, I'll be honest, kind of laborious because it's text. I really hate UVing text. I don't know why. It's just a bit boring. It's pretty straightforward, at this point, I'm kind of glad that I only have to UV this once and I can just mirror it over. It's pretty straightforward, honestly, with this section. I just want to make sure that I triangulate any engons in the low poly and have proper geometry, because it's pretty necessary for the baking stage that I control the triangulation within my modeling package, my DCC, whatever that means. I just hear it being thrown around every now and then. In Blender first before baking, otherwise when it gets into engine, and whatever engine that you're using, it will always triangulate the mesh for you anyway, because all polygons are just triangles basically. What I'm basically trying to do here is just reduce the stretching in the UV. As you can see at the top there, it's become quite distorted. An easy way, should I say, rather than the only way to resolve this is to break up the UV even more so and reduce the stretching like we did before on the side of the grip with that ridge. Had a brain freeze there, I don't know why I stopped. Sometimes it's actually not so much of an issue. Again, there's trade-offs, and you just have to go from experience and test things out. Do some test bakes, and if it's not working out, then reevaluate and re-UV. So most of that is actually done. So technically, if I was being super optimal, I wouldn't even have that side plate there on the other side in the UV. What I would do is I would essentially just have it a mirrored UV. And I realise I actually can't mirror it over, namely because the geometry is actually quite different. The insert at the bottom there, you can see, is actually not a screw. It looks like an exploded bullet, or a bullet that's hit metal, and it's sort of like just shrapnel now. It's exploded, expanded. I think it's just the end of the bolt that's just been bashed in the reference, or I don't know what it is, to be honest. But it's different enough to warrant unique UVs. I'm not going to do the logo because I've already done that. I'm not sure why I'm doing it like this, because it's not how I did it on the other side. Or maybe I did. Yes, I did, because of the stretching. So I was just playing with the reshape island tool with that section. On the other side, I actually didn't bother quadrifying or reshaping that section, so that's what I've done here as well. Again, just looking at the UV, just making sure I haven't got any strange sections, which I do here. I'm not really sure where this is, so there we go. Let's rectify that. Shows to me that it's not straight, so let's flatten that out and re-UV this from project from view. That way we get a perfect UV island from that selection. Whenever it's flat and faces an axis like this perfectly, you know, whether it's X, Y, or Z, I'll always project from view from that particular view, just so I get a perfect representation in the UV. Let's finish straightening these sections off. With the different tools and add-ons that I have, Zen UV, UV Toolkit, and UV Packmaster 2, I append all the most used tools from those add-ons into my quick favorites, which is context sensitive, so these won't show up in the 3D view, or only show up in the UV editor, which is really handy. And it means I don't have to go sifting through each add-on, and it's essentially making your own add-on in a way, if you think about it, because you're just pulling all the necessary tools that you need into one single place. Again, just fixing some issues here. Sometimes it might look like you're re-UVing the same section over and over again, but you want to get it perfect. You want to get it as good as possible, so you can get the best baking results. Baking, not bacon. I'm just going to run that through UV Packmaster and set a checker texture to it. I do that at the end because it allows me to see what pieces need to be UV'd. So I've mirrored so it flips onto the other side, but the problem with that in some instances is that any text might get flipped as well, and so it's backwards, so you might need to mirror it again in the opposite axis so that the UV is correct. So I'm just going to flip it around here and then mirror it in the X and mirror again in the Y, so it's correct. And because the bolts are different, I'm just going to separate those and basically just remove the old one. A little sneaky. It just means I'm going to have to re-UV this again. And I guess you could say Well, couldn't you just rotated the mesh to the correct position? I could have, and I probably should have, but I didn't. So that's my fault. So I'm going to join them back. And I actually just checked the face orientation, because when you mirror something, usually in Blender for some reason, it will also flip the faces, not immediately, but when you join objects together after mirroring something, you'll often find that the normals of that flipped object becomes inverted, which is really frustrating. But now that everything is done, I'm just going to pack everything together. Now that it's done, I'm just going to let it do its thing, basically. I think if I remember correctly, the pixel margin is something like 4 pixels for padding and 4 pixels for margin. It may be 6 and 6. It may be a combination of the two, 4 and 6. It depends on the texture size, essentially. And it's done. I'm pretty happy with the UV, and hopefully you agree the result was worth an hour's work. It's actually not that long, really. All that's left to do now is just to properly rename anything that we duplicated, has the proper naming for the object name and also the data name. But yeah, I hope that whoever watches this has found it helpful. This has been a real-time video. Only a couple of sections where I have cut out because I just went missing in action. I don't remember why, and there was nothing going on screen. I just cut that section out, and hopefully you haven't noticed. But yeah, this has all been in real time in just under an hour. I really do think that UVing in Blender is really easy and really quite fun, actually, bar a few parts of this object. And I hope it has helped, and if it has, please leave a comment or whatever. And yeah, happy UVing. Peace. Look at that wireframe. Ooh.